She weighed nearly 300 pounds, and every soul in Black Hollow had laughed at her for it. He stood 6'4" with a face carved up like old leather, and every soul in Black Hollow feared him for it. Nobody wanted either of them. Nobody thought they deserved anything better than the life that had already beaten them down. So when Abigail Hartwell stood up in the middle of the general store and said she'd take Boone Mercer for a husband, that big, scarred, half-wild mountain man the whole town treated like a curse, the room went so quiet you could hear the flies on the window glass. Then came the laughter. Then came the whispers. And then came everything else. If you're reading this story, please hit like and comment your city name below. I want to know how far my story has come. Don't leave. The best is yet to come. The morning Abigail Hartwell made the most talked-about decision in Black Hollow's 40-year history. She had $7.32 to her name, a sack of cornmeal that was more weevil than grain, and a landlord who had given her until the end of the week to clear out of the room she'd rented above the feed store. She hadn't slept. She'd been awake since before the sky turned gray, sitting on the edge of her narrow cot with her hands folded in her lap, staring at the wall like it might tell her something useful. It didn't. The wall was just boards and gaps, same as everything else in this town. Black Hollow sat in a shallow valley at the foot of the Gray Rock Mountains, and it had the permanent look of a place that had meant to move on but never quite got around to it. The main street was rutted dirt that turned to mud in the rain and cracked dust in the heat, lined with buildings that leaned slightly toward each other like old men sharing a secret. There was a general store, a saloon, a livery stable, a church. Nobody talked about much, and 24 houses fanned out behind them like an afterthought. The nearest town of any real size was 3 days' ride east, and most people in Black Hollow either didn't know what they were missing or had decided not to think about it too hard. Abigail had lived here her whole life. 24 years in this valley, and she still felt like a stranger in it. She was a big woman, not simply heavy, big in the full sense, broad-shouldered and thick-limbed, built like someone designed for hard work, even if the world had mostly given her nothing but hard luck. She had a round, pretty face when she wasn't frowning, dark hair she kept pinned back because it was easier that way, and eyes the color of creek water, greenish-brown and clear, the kind of eyes that noticed everything. What those eyes noticed, most days, was the way people looked at her, or looked past her, or looked at her and then looked quickly away, like seeing her too long might be catching. She'd grown up in this town with a mother who meant well, and a father who drank badly, and when both of them were gone, her mother to fever, her father to the bottle, and then the river, she'd been left with the house, the debts attached to it, and a reputation she hadn't earned but couldn't shake. The house went to the bank inside of 8 months. The debts took longer to die. For 3 years she'd worked wherever she could find work, washing clothes for the Dunmore family who paid her in cornmeal and the occasional leftover chicken, cleaning the saloon on Tuesday mornings when the smell of spilled whiskey and tobacco was thick enough to make your eyes water, mending shirts and trousers for the miners who came through on their way up into the mountains. The money trickled in and trickled right back out, and she'd been holding the whole thing together by the thinnest margins since before her 22nd birthday. And now Cyrus Fitch, who owned the feed store and the room above it, and 3 other properties in Black Hollow besides, had looked at her across his counter last Tuesday with that particular expression, the one that was almost apologetic but mostly just satisfied, and told her the rent was going up and her current arrangement was, regrettably, no longer workable. "Got a family coming in from Breckenridge," he'd said, picking at his thumbnail. "Man's got a wife and 4 children, needs the space. You understand?" She understood. She understood that Cyrus Fitch had wanted her out for a year and had finally found a reason he could say out loud. So she'd had 6 days to figure out what came next, and she'd spent 5 of them turning the problem over and over and arriving at the same answer every time. Nothing. There was nothing. There was no family who would take her in, no savings to rent elsewhere, no prospect of work that paid enough to matter. The nearest women's boarding house was in Caldwell Springs, 3 days east, and she had no horse and no way to get one. She lay in bed that last night and let herself think about things she usually kept sealed off in some back room of her mind. That she was 24 and unmarried, and that was not going to change. That she had been told, in various ways and by various people, that she was not the sort of woman a man chose. That her body was the thing that had defined her in this town long before anyone troubled themselves to learn anything else about her. That the women who might have been friends kept a certain distance, like her circumstances were contagious. That she had not been held by another person in longer than she could exactly remember. She was not a woman who cried easily. She didn't cry then. She just lay there with the dark pressing down and thought hard thoughts until the sky started to lighten. She walked to the general store at 7:30 in the morning, before the heat set in. Harlan Greer's store was the nearest thing Black Hollow had to a town center. If you needed something, you went there, and if something needed to be said publicly, it got said there. The store smelled of pine boards, dried beans, tobacco, and leather, and it always had 3 or 4 men standing around near the front, pretending to examine merchandise while actually just waiting for something to happen. That morning, standing near the sugar barrel, was Tom Aldrich, who ran the livery, and next to him was Pete Sunderman, who had a small cattle operation 2 miles out of town and liked everyone to know about it. Old Will Favor was sitting on his usual stool near the door, pretending to whittle when he was mostly just watching. Harlan himself was behind the counter, making notes in his ledger with the careful slowness of a man who wanted it known he was busy. There was a notice pinned to the board beside the door. Abigail had seen it 3 days ago and walked past it without stopping. She stopped now. It was hand-lettered on brown paper in the careful, labored script of a man who had taught himself to write later in life than most. She read it again, same as she had read it before, and felt something shift in her chest. Not excitement. More like the feeling you get at the edge of a high place when you stop being afraid and start being something else entirely. Seeking a wife. Can offer steady home, land, and honest work. Am not a soft man, but will be a fair one. No objection to plain women or women of difficulty. Prefer someone with good sense over good looks. Arrangements can be made. B. Mercer, Grey Rock Summit. Grey Rock Summit. She knew that name. Everyone in Black Hollow knew that name, the same way they knew to check where their children were when certain clouds came in from the west. Boone Mercer lived up in the Grey Rock Range. Half a day's ride into wilderness most people didn't go into without good reason. He came into town 3 or 4 times a year for supplies, and every time he did, the street got a little quieter. He was enormous, not just tall, but densely built, wide through the chest and shoulders in a way that made door frames seem like a personal insult. His face was badly scarred on the left side, some old injury that had healed wrong, pulling that corner of his mouth into a permanent suggestion of a sneer. He never said much. He paid for what he bought, loaded it on his horse, and left. But the stories that accumulated around him in the years between his visits had grown into something almost mythological. He had killed a man in a dispute over a property line. This was disputed. He had once scared off 4 armed riders by himself, just by standing in the road and looking at them. This one, Abigail thought, might even be true. He kept no company, wanted none, and had made it very clear on at least 2 occasions that the part of the Grey Rock Range he occupied was his, and anyone who disagreed was welcome to come and say so to his face. The notice had been on the board for 2 weeks. No woman had responded. Abigail stood there reading it for the second time, and Tom Aldrich said, "Don't get ideas, Abigail." She looked up at him. He was grinning in a way that wasn't quite mean, but wasn't quite friendly either. "That man up there's half wild," Aldrich said. "Can't imagine what'd become of a woman who went up there alone with him." "She wouldn't last the winter," Sunderman said, and then laughed at his own joke. Old Will Favor said nothing. He watched her with rheumy eyes and didn't stop his whittling. Harlan looked up from his ledger briefly, decided this wasn't his business, and looked back down. Abigail took a slow breath through her nose. She looked at the notice again. She looked at the $7.32 she'd counted this morning and would be counting again tonight when the room she'd slept in her whole life was no longer hers. Then she said, "I'll take it." Each shot. The store went quiet. "Beg pardon?" said Aldrich. "The notice." She unpinned it from the board and turned around to face them all. "I'll answer it. Someone point me to where I can get a message up to Grey Rock Summit." The reaction was exactly what she had expected, which meant she was prepared for it and not destroyed by it, though it wasn't pleasant. By afternoon, the whole town knew. By the following morning, half of them had come up with something clever to say about it. Margaret Dunmore, the wife of the family Abigail had washed clothes for, stopped her on the boardwalk outside the dry goods and said, with an expression of practiced concern that didn't quite reach her eyes, "Abigail, honey, you know what that man is like. This isn't a decision you should make out of desperation. I'm not desperate, Abigail said. Margaret's eyes traveled briefly over her, from her worn-down boots to the hair she hadn't been able to arrange properly this morning. Well, she said. All right. Pete Sunderman told his wife, and his wife told Clara Hooks, and Clara Hooks made it her business to tell roughly everyone she encountered over the next 48 hours. The version that circulated through Black Hollow went something like, "That poor Hartwell woman has gone and lost her mind. She's written to Boone Mercer of all people. She must be more desperate than she looks." She was not more desperate than she looked. She was exactly as desperate as she looked, and she had made a calculation that most of the people commenting on it were not in a position to make themselves. She had sent her message up with a miner named Grady Cole, who made the ride into the Grey Rock Range twice a month and owed her a favor from when she'd mended his riding coat for free 2 winters back. She had written it plainly. "I am responding to your notice. I have good sense, and I am not afraid of hard work. I have no family to speak of and no particular prospects. I am 24 years old, and my situation is honest, if not comfortable. If you're genuinely looking for a wife and not looking for something else, I'm willing to meet and discuss terms. A. Hartwell, Black Hollow." She had folded it, sealed it with the last of the wax she had left, and handed it to Grady without explaining herself. He'd ridden out the next morning. She'd waited. Boone Mercer came into Black Hollow 4 days later. She heard the horse before she saw him. She was in the back of the general store, buying as much as her money could reasonably stretch, when the street outside got very quiet in that particular way it got whenever Boone Mercer appeared in it. She took a slow breath, set her purchases on the counter, and walked out. He was tying his horse at the post outside the saloon. She had seen him before, the way everyone in Black Hollow had seen him, from a distance, briefly, in the way you observe a weather event passing through. Up close, he was something else. He was taller than she remembered, or maybe it was just the way he stood, very straight and very still, that made him seem bigger than the space he occupied. He had brown hair going gray at the sides, worn too long and not well tended. His hands were enormous. The scar on the left side of his face was worse up close, a wide seamed mark that ran from his jaw to his cheekbone, healed badly and long ago. He was wearing a coat that had been good once and was now simply functional. His eyes, when he turned to look at her, were gray, the color of the mountain in flat light. He looked at her for a moment without speaking. "You're the woman who wrote," he said. It was not a question. "Abigail Hartwell," she said. He looked at her a moment longer, not the way most men looked at her, the quick up and down that preceded a decision they'd already made. He looked at her face, at her eyes specifically, like he was trying to read something written small. "You understand what I'm offering," he said. "Land and honest work," she said. That's what the notice said. Something moved across his expression that she couldn't entirely read. "Come over here where we're not being watched quite so much," he said. They weren't in fact being watched quite so much. They were being watched intensely by roughly every person within line of sight. But she followed him to the far end of the boardwalk where a gap between the buildings gave them a little air. "Tell me your situation," he said. She told him. All of it, plainly, without embellishing or softening. The room, the debt, the money, the work that had kept her going but wasn't going to keep her much longer. She watched his face as she spoke. He didn't wince, and he didn't look sympathetic, and he didn't look satisfied the way some men did when they heard about someone else's trouble. He just listened. When she finished, he said, "I've had 2 women answer notices before. Both times they came up, saw the cabin, saw how far it is from town, and came back down inside of a week. I'm not offering a comfortable life. I'm offering a real one, which isn't the same thing." "I know," she said. "You don't yet. But you might." He was quiet for a moment, looking out at the street. "I'm not a man who'll be unkind to you. I want that said now. I've been called a great many things, and some of them are true. Unkind to women isn't one of them." "Why do you want a wife?" she asked. It came out more directly than she'd intended, but she didn't apologize for it. He looked at her sideways. "Because I'm 41 years old, and I've been alone in that mountain for 14 years, and the arrangement works, but it doesn't work well," he said. "Because I've got more land than one man can work, because I'd like someone with good sense around when things go sideways." A pause. "Because a person can get tired of their own company," It was the longest speech she'd heard him make. She got the impression it cost him something. "All right," she said. "All right?" he repeated. "All right, let's do it," she said. "We can go to the judge's office today if you want. I've got nowhere else to be at the moment." He stared at her for a long moment. Then something happened on his scarred face that wasn't exactly a smile, but was in the neighborhood of one. One corner of his mouth, the good side, tipping up just slightly. "Judge Farnham's office is on the east end of the street," he said. Judge Raymond Farnham had served Black Hollow for 11 years, and in that time he had seen marriages that surprised him. He had not seen one that surprised him quite like this one. He looked at Boone Mercer, filling the doorframe. He looked at Abigail Hartwell, standing beside him with her hands clasped in front of her and her chin up. He looked between them twice, clearly searching for a conventional explanation and failing to find one. "You both understand this is a legal arrangement," he said, "not something you can just walk away from." "I understand what marriage is," Abigail said. "Mr. Mercer?" "Same," Boone said. Farnham looked at them a moment longer, then he reached for his ledger. "All right," he said, "let's get the particulars." The ceremony, if you could call it that, took less than 15 minutes. There were two witnesses, Grady Cole, who had happened to be outside and was clearly stunned to find himself in this position, and Farnham's clerk, a young man named Douglas, who looked like he was watching history happen, whether he was ready for it or not. Abigail signed her name in the ledger. Boone signed his. Farnham said the legal words. Abigail's hand, when she offered it to Boone at the end, was steady. His grip was brief and firm, like a man confirming a business arrangement. She gathered her things from the room above the feed store that afternoon. There was not much: a trunk with her clothes, a tin box with her mother's few items in it, a blanket she'd made herself over one long winter, and 3 books she'd carried since her mother died. Boone loaded them onto his horse without comment. Cyrus Fitch watched from the doorway of his store with an expression Abigail couldn't entirely name. Not happy, exactly. Maybe a little unsettled, like he'd expected her to simply disappear and hadn't anticipated this particular resolution. She didn't say goodbye to Fitch. She didn't say goodbye to much of anyone. Tom Aldrich was standing outside the livery, and he called out to her as she walked past. "You're going to regret this, Abigail." She didn't answer him. She had nothing to say to Tom Aldrich that he was prepared to hear. Margaret Dunmore was at her own gate, watching as Abigail passed. Their eyes met briefly. Margaret had the decency to look at the ground first. Boone brought a second horse. He hadn't said as much in town, but he had it tied behind the main street at the edge of the settlement. A bay mare, older, calm. He helped Abigail up without any of the particular fuss that would have insulted her, and they rode out of Black Hollow in the late afternoon, the mountains ahead of them going gold and purple in the early evening light. She didn't look back. That felt important. Up. The ride up to Grey Rock Summit took most of the next day. It was not a trail in any well-worn sense. It was more of an intention, a route that Boone knew by heart and she had to trust by necessity. Through stands of pine and spruce where the light came in flat and green, over creek crossings that were straightforward in summer but probably treacherous the rest of the year, and along ridgelines that gave her sudden vertiginous views back down into the valley, where Black Hollow sat small and ordinary-looking in its hollow. Boone did not make conversation. This could have been uncomfortable, but it wasn't, particularly. She had been around men who talked too much, and she had been around men who said nothing and made you feel the weight of their silence like a judgment. Boone's silence was of a different kind. It was just the silence of someone who didn't feel the need to fill space with noise, and she found she didn't either. They stopped at midday by a creek and ate what he had packed. Dried venison and hard biscuit, nothing warm. He filled the canteens. She stretched her back out against a boulder and watched an osprey circle something in the creek bed below. "Does it have a name?" she asked. "The mountain. Locals call it Grey Rock," he said. "My section doesn't have a different name. I've just always called it the summit." "How long have you been up there?" 14 years come spring. He was repackaging the food, not looking at her. "Came up after the war. Needed somewhere quiet." She didn't ask which war, and he didn't offer to clarify. There had been enough conflict in the years before she was born that a man of his age could have served in 2. "Did you build the cabin yourself?" "Most of it. Repaired it over the years. It's not much to look at." "As long as it keeps the weather out." He did look at her then, briefly. "It does that," he said. They rode on. The cabin appeared when she wasn't expecting it. They came around a jut of rock, and then there it was, set back against the tree line on a south-facing slope with a good view of the valley below and mountains stacked up behind it like a painting. It was larger than she'd imagined, 2 solid rooms at least from the outside, with a covered porch and a stone chimney and a small outbuilding set a little ways off. The logs were old and weathered to silver gray. The roof was solid. There were stacks of cut wood along one wall that went high enough to suggest he had done this before, had done it many times and understood exactly how much winter took. It was not pretty, but it was real in a way that impressed her. Every part of it looked like it had been built by someone who understood weather and cold and the particular logic of surviving in a place that was not interested in making things easy. "This is it," Boone said. "It's more than I expected," she said, and meant it. He looked at her sideways again with that not-quite smile and led the horses to the small corral behind the outbuilding. Inside, the main room had a fireplace that took up half one wall, a heavy table, 2 chairs, and shelving on every surface that held organized rows of supplies, tools, and a few things that surprised her. A small stack of books, worn and clearly read. A battered fiddle hanging on a nail by the door. A tin mug that had a crack in the handle repaired carefully with wire. Rooms say things about people if you know how to read them, and Abigail read this one. This was a man who paid attention to things, who fixed what was broken and kept what had value, and tolerated no disorder because disorder in this place, she was beginning to understand, had consequences. There was a second room that had a bed in it, a proper one, wide and well-made, with a mattress stuffed with what felt like pine needles and a quilt. He had made the bed, she noticed. Made it that morning before he rode down, perhaps. The thought of that, the deliberateness of it, the preparation, settled somewhere in her chest. "You can have the bed," he said from the doorway. "I'll take the floor." "The bed is big enough for 2 people who are adults about it," she said. He was quiet for a moment. "All right," he said. She didn't sleep much her first night. She lay on her side, listening to the wind work itself around the corners of the cabin, listening to the forest sounds outside, things moving in the dark, the occasional snap of a branch, the distant sound of water. Boone slept, or seemed to, still and quiet beside her. The mattress was harder than she was used to and softer than the floor would have been. She lay there and ran through the arithmetic of what she had done, same as she had been running through it for a week. It did not frighten her the way she thought it might. What she felt was something closer to the sensation of solid ground under your feet after too long on uncertain footing. Not comfortable, necessarily, but real. At some point before dawn, she slept. Pan. The first weeks had an education in them that no one could have given her beforehand. She was not a woman who had lived soft. She had done physical work her whole life, the kind of work that leaves calluses and aches that become background noise. But the mountain had a different scale of hard. The mornings started before first light, and the days did not end until well after dark. And between those bookends was a relentless procession of tasks that each contained a dozen smaller tasks nested inside them. Water came from a creek a quarter-mile from the cabin, and it needed to be carried. Wood needed to be split and stacked, and the fires needed to be maintained because, in the high country, the temperature dropped to uncomfortable even in summer and to serious in spring and fall. The animals needed feeding and tending. Boone kept 2 horses, 4 goats, and a small flock of chickens, and each had their own requirements and personalities and ways of making your life difficult. The kitchen garden was more ambitious than she'd expected, a half-acre plot that Boone had been working alone for years, growing root vegetables and beans, and 2 kinds of squash, and struggling, she could see immediately, to keep it properly weeded. She took that over without being asked, and he noticed but didn't say much about it. He was like that. He noticed things and registered them in his face just briefly, a small shift around the eyes, and then moved on. She began to catalog those shifts the way you catalog the sounds of a new house, building a private dictionary of what they meant. The look that meant he was thinking about something difficult. The look that meant something had gone right that he hadn't expected. The look that meant he was watching her work and not quite sure what he was seeing. She had her own adjustments. She had to learn the rhythm of his days, and he had to learn the shape of hers. and they had to find the places where those two things could run parallel without colliding. It was not always easy. There were moments in those first weeks when the close quarters produced friction. She moved things he expected to be in certain places. He assumed she understood processes he had never explained, and they had to work out between them, carefully and without a lot of ceremony, how to be two people in a small space. "I put the flour in the other tin," she said one morning when she found him looking confused at the shelf. "The original tin has a crack in the bottom. I found it leaking." He looked at the tin she indicated, ran his thumb along the bottom edge, found the crack. He said, and put it down. Meaning what?" she asked. "Meaning I hadn't noticed that," he said. "I should have." "It was a small crack," she said. "Easier to see from a different angle." He looked at her. "You don't have to make excuses for me not noticing things in my own kitchen." "I'm not making excuses," she said. "I'm just noting that some things need a fresh pair of eyes. That's not a failure of yours, it's just geography." He was quiet for a moment. "You argue like a lawyer," he said. "I argue like someone who grew up around a drunk and learned to choose words carefully," she said, which was more than she'd meant to say. Something moved across his face. Not pity. She would have walked out the door if it had been pity. It was something more careful than that. "I'll keep that in mind," he said, and went back to what he was doing. She met the nearest neighbors inside of 3 weeks, and the meeting was not warm. The Grubb brothers, Wade and Silas, ran a cattle operation that occupied the northern slope of the Gray Rock Range, about 1.5 miles from Boone's property. They were large men in the way that comes from work rather than genetics, tanned to leather, with the squinting, suspicious look of people who had decided the world owed them a grudge and were working from that premise. They rode up one afternoon when Boone was out checking the fence line and Abigail was in the garden. They stopped their horses at the edge of the cleared ground and looked at her without dismounting, which told her something about them immediately. "You're the new wife," the older one said. He would have been Wade. She'd heard descriptions. "Abigail Mercer," she said. She had not entirely gotten used to that name yet, but she used it deliberately now. "Huh," said Wade. He looked over the property with the particular look of a man assessing something he feels he has a claim to. "Boone around?" "He'll be back before dark," she said. "We'll wait." "You're welcome to wait over there," she said, pointing to the far edge of the yard away from the garden. "I'm working." Wade looked at her for a long moment with the expression of a man who was not accustomed to being pointed anywhere by a woman. His brother Silas said nothing, just watched her with flat, dull eyes. "Your husband knows we've got a disagreement about the eastern fence line," Wade said. "He's mentioned a fence dispute," she said. "He hasn't mentioned it being settled." "We think it has," Wade said. "We think the line's about 300 feet further west than Mercer claims." "Then you'll want to take that up with Boone," she said. "I'm not in a position to negotiate property boundaries on a Tuesday afternoon in the garden." Silas made a sound that might have been a laugh. Wade just looked at her. "You're not what I expected," he said. "Most people aren't," she said, and went back to her weeding. When Boone returned and she told him, something hardened in his face that she hadn't seen before. Not anger exactly, the kind of look that precedes an old trouble reasserting itself. "They've been pressing on that fence line for 2 years," he said. "It's not a mistake. They know exactly where the line is." "What's on those 300 feet?" "Good water," he said. "There's a spring, my spring, on my land that they want." She absorbed that. "Are you going to go talk to them?" "I'll talk to them," he said. "Talking hasn't helped much up to now." "What would help?" He was quiet for a moment, standing at the window, looking out at the dark coming in over the ridge. "Documentation might," he said. "My deed is in order, but if we ever got to any kind of formal proceeding, having someone who could read documents and argue them would be useful." "I can read documents," she said. He turned to look at her. "I went to school until I was 16, she said. "I'm not a lawyer, but I can read a deed and I know what a property description should say. Let me look at yours." He looked at her for a moment with that expression she was still learning to read, the one around the eyes. Then he went to the tin box on the top shelf and took out a folded set of papers. They sat at the table until the fire burned low, and she read through the deed line by line, while he watched and she explained what she was seeing, and he asked questions that were sharp and well considered, and she answered them. By the end of the evening, they had a clearer picture of the legal ground they were standing on than Boone had apparently had before. And when she looked up from the last page, she found him looking at her with something in his face that was unguarded in a way she hadn't seen yet. "Where did you learn to read legal language?" he asked. "My father was terrible with money and therefore spent a lot of time with documents he didn't understand," she said. "I learned to understand them so I could tell him when someone was trying to cheat him. It didn't save him, but it educated me." Boone was quiet. Then he said, "That's a hard way to learn." "Most useful things are," she said. She closed the deed and folded it back into the tin box, and she was aware of something shifting in the cabin, something in the air between them that had been carefully neutral for 3 weeks and was now, very slightly, something else. Not dramatic, just different. Like a door had opened a crack somewhere, and they were both pretending not to notice the new light coming through. "I should look at that chicken coop tomorrow," she said. "There's a gap in the north wall, I noticed. Things can get in." "I know," he said. "I've been meaning to fix it." "I can fix it," she said. "I've repaired worse with less." He looked at her for a moment. "I know you can," he said, and she got the feeling that wasn't something he said often or lightly. Outside, the wind was working itself around the cabin again, and the fire had burned down to coals, and somewhere out in the dark, the mountains went on in all directions. And Abigail Hartwell, Abigail Mercer now, sat at a table in a cabin at the edge of a wilderness and felt, for the first time in longer than she wanted to name, like she was somewhere she was supposed to be. It wasn't easy. It wasn't safe. It wasn't anything like what she'd imagined, in those years of imagining things differently. But it was real, and it was hers. And those two things together were more than she'd had for a long time. She went to bed. She slept. And 3 weeks after that, just past the first month, she went into the garden one morning and found half of it wrecked. Not by weather, by boots. Someone had walked through the bean rows in the night, methodically, doing the kind of damage that looks like it took effort to accomplish. Half the squash vines were broken. The irrigation channel she had spent 4 days improving was blocked with rocks that had been deliberately placed. She stood at the edge of the garden and looked at it without speaking for a long moment. Boone came up behind her, saw it, and went very still in the way he went still when something had moved past the threshold from ordinary difficulty into deliberate threat. "They wanted us to know," he said. His voice was quiet and flat in a way that was more alarming than if he'd raised it. "Yes," she said. She looked at the ruined rows, at the weeks of work undone overnight, at the careful planning pulled apart by someone else's hands, and felt something move through her that was not quite grief and not quite rage, and was in fact both of them running together into something cold and focused. "I want to fix the irrigation first," she said. "The plants that are still rooted need water, or they'll die by afternoon." He looked at her. "We can be angry about it after," she said. "Fix it first." He was quiet for a moment. Then he picked up one of the displaced rocks and set it aside, and they worked through the morning without saying much, salvaging what could be salvaged. And by noon the water was running properly through the channel again, and there were still beans in the ground, and the remaining squash would take, she thought, if the next few weeks were reasonable. None of which changed what had been done. None of which changed what was coming. But she had learned, a long time ago, that the thing you had to do first was make sure whatever was still alive stayed alive. Everything else came after. The garden came back slower than she wanted and faster than she had any right to expect. Abigail replanted the bean rows by hand over 2 days, pressing each seed into the turned earth with her thumb, spacing them the way her mother had shown her once in a different garden in a different life. Boone repaired the irrigation channel with flat stones from the creek bed, setting them more carefully than they had been set before, so that the water ran clean and even. They didn't talk much while they worked. There wasn't much to say that the work wasn't already saying. What had been done to the garden was a message, and they both understood it. The Grubb brothers had not come back. No one had come up the mountain openly, but the damage had been specific and deliberate. Not the random trampling of an animal, not an accident of weather, but the careful work of a person who understood enough about gardens to know exactly where to hurt one. That specificity was its own kind of threat, the kind that meant we have been watching and we know what matters to you and we can reach it. Boone spent 3 days after that walking the fence line, all of it, every post and wire. He came back the second evening with his jaw set in a way she'd begun to recognize, and told her that the eastern line, the disputed section, had been moved. 3 posts pulled from the ground and reset further west than the deed described. Not enough to make an obvious scene over. Enough to matter. "That's not a mistake," she said. "No," he agreed. "What do you do about it?" "Put them back where they belong," he said, and went out again in the morning and did exactly that. She didn't ask how the conversation with Wade Grubb had gone when they'd inevitably crossed paths at the fence. She could read it in the set of his shoulders when he came home. They ate in silence that night, and it was not a comfortable silence. "They're not going to stop," she said, finally, when the meal was half done. Boone set his fork down. "No. Then we should think about what we do when they don't," she said. "Not react to each thing as it comes. Actually think." He looked across the table at her. He did that sometimes. Just looked, for a beat too long for social comfort, like he was still working something out about her. She had gotten used to it. "What are you thinking?" he asked. "I'm thinking your deed is solid," she said. "I'm thinking the spring is clearly on your property. I'm thinking that if they want to claim otherwise, they'd have to do it in front of someone official, and right now there's no official record of any dispute." "Farnham?" he said. "Farnham would be a start," she said. "Send a letter describing the fence interference. Make it part of the record before anything gets worse." He was quiet. She could see him turning it over. "I'm not much for letters," he said. "Or courts." "I know," she said. "But a written record is harder to argue with than your word against theirs. Especially," she stopped. "Especially given what people think of me," he finished. Not bitter, just level. "Yes," she said, because there was no point in wrapping it. He looked at his plate, then back at her. "Write the letter," he said. "Well." She wrote it that night by firelight, sitting at the table with the deed spread out beside her for reference, composing sentences in her head before committing them to paper because paper was not something she could afford to waste on drafts. She had a neat hand, another thing her mother had given her, insisting on it when Abigail was young enough to find it tedious and old enough now to be grateful. The letter was specific. Dates, distances, descriptions. It named the Grubb brothers by name and described the fence interference in language that was factual and without complaint, which she knew carried more weight than outrage would. She described the deed boundaries clearly, citing the section descriptions Boone's land grant used. She closed by requesting that the incident be noted and that any future disputes regarding the boundary be addressed through proper proceedings. She handed it to Boone in the morning. He read it slowly, lips moving slightly, and when he was done, he looked up. "You didn't put anything in there you couldn't prove," he said. "That's the point," she said. He folded it carefully. "I'll take it down to Farnham on Thursday when I go for supplies." Thursday came and he went, and she spent the day the way she'd been spending most of the days he was away, working through the list of things that needed attention, which never got shorter, only rearranged. The chicken coop needed the gap in the north wall properly sealed, not just patched, and she spent most of the morning on that with a hammer and board ends she found stacked behind the outbuilding. The goats needed their hooves checked. One of them, the brown one she had privately named Marlowe, because he had a tragic expression, had been favoring his left front leg for a week. She sorted through the remaining dried stores and cataloged what they had and what they'd need before the first freeze, which was still months away, but not so many that it didn't require thinking about. She was good at thinking about the future. She had spent most of her life doing it because the present had not always been somewhere she could afford to stay too long. Boone returned in the late afternoon with supplies loaded on the pack horse and a look on his face she hadn't quite seen before. "Farnham took the letter," he said he'd note it. "But?" He set down the supplies and began to unload without looking at her. "Ran into Pete Sunderman in the store. And the Aldrich boy. They know about the dispute. I don't know how, but they know, or they know something. Sunderman made a comment about how I ought to think hard about whether the mountain was worth the trouble." "What did you say?" "Nothing worth repeating," he said. She considered asking him to repeat it anyway, then decided against it. She could imagine it roughly. "Sunderman's friendly with the Grubbs," she said. "He runs cattle on the same eastern range," Boone said. "They've got interests that line up." "So this isn't just two brothers with a fence dispute," she said. He stopped what he was doing and looked at her directly. "I've thought so for a while," he said. "The grub operation is bigger than what two men should be able to run. Someone's been helping them, financing them, something. I don't have proof of it. But the push on my land started after the Ashmont company started sending riders through." "Ashmont," she said. "Who is that?" "Who?" "Land company," he said. "Operates out of the Eastern Territories. They've been buying up rangeland for 2 years, or pushing people off it when they can't buy." He paused. "They came to me once. A man named Colton, well-dressed, very polite. Offered me a price for this section that was less than the land is worth, but more than most people see in a year. You said no." "I said no," he confirmed. He left politely. 3 months later, the trouble with the grubs started. She stood in the middle of the yard and looked at the mountains going blue in the afternoon haze, and felt the shape of the problem shift into something larger and less clean than a fence dispute between neighbors. "Why didn't you tell me this earlier?" she asked. "You'd only been here 2 weeks," he said. "That's not really an answer." He was quiet. Then, "I'm not used to having someone to tell things to." It was said without apology and without performance, just the plain fact of it, and she accepted it the same way. "Well," she said, "I'm here now." But October came in hard and early. She had grown up in the valley, where the seasons changed gradually, and winter arrived as a process rather than an event. On the mountain it was different. One morning it was the end of summer, and the next morning it wasn't. And in between was a single night of wind that stripped the aspens and left everything clean and sharp and cold in a way that meant business. She had been preparing for it since August, working from her mental inventory of what the cabin had and what it needed, pushing Boone gently on the things he had been putting off the way a person puts off anything that isn't immediately dangerous. More wood, cut and stacked. The gaps in the cabin's north wall better chinked, the root cellar restocked, the animals' shelter reinforced. He worked without complaint when she laid it out, and she had begun to notice that he worked better when she was specific than when she was general. The north corner post needs bracing before the freeze landed differently than we should get ready for winter. She filed that away. The winter itself was not the terrible thing she had anticipated, or not only that. It was hard in the way that physical work is hard, relentless and honest, demanding everything and giving back something that wasn't exactly comfort, but was in its own way sustaining. The cold pressed in around the cabin every night, and every morning they pushed back against it together, and it did not defeat them. There were evenings when the snow came down in the dark outside and the fire was good, and Boone took the battered fiddle down from its nail and played. Not well exactly, but with a kind of rough earnestness that was better than competence in its way. He knew old tunes, ballads that were mostly about loss, which she supposed said something about the tradition he'd learned from. She listened from her chair across the fire and didn't say much, and he didn't ask her to. One evening he stopped mid-tune and said, without looking up from the fiddle, "You don't like this one." "I didn't say anything," she said. "You went quiet a different way," he said. She considered this. "It's a sad song," she said. "Most of them are," he said. "I know, She stopped. "I've had enough sad things. I don't always want to invite more." He was quiet for a moment. Then he started playing something different, something she didn't recognize in a major key, quicker and lighter. Not joyful exactly, but not mourning either. "Better?" he said. "Better," she said. They had been sharing the bed for months by then, and it had remained what it had started as, practical, careful, two people maintaining a respectful distance in close quarters. But things were shifting, slowly, in ways she tried not to calculate too carefully. The way he sometimes paused near her when they were working, not doing anything, just present. The way she had started to notice small things he did without comment. That he always set her coffee down on the left side where her hand was, because he'd watched long enough to notice she reached that way without thinking. That he'd started leaving the lamp burning in the main room if she was awake late, so she wouldn't have to work by firelight alone. She did not romanticize any of it. She was too old and too practical for that, and she suspected he was as well. But she was honest enough with herself to admit that the arithmetic of this arrangement had moved past what she'd expected when she'd stood in Harlan Greer's store and taken a notice off the wall. The first serious trouble came in February, when the worst of the winter was theoretically past, but the mountain hadn't gotten word of it yet. She was in the yard, breaking ice from the water barrel, when she saw the rider coming up the trail. Not the grubs, she knew their horses. This was someone she hadn't seen before, well mounted on a dark gray, wearing a coat that was too good for the country he was riding through. She set down the hammer and waited. The rider pulled up at the edge of the yard. He was maybe 50, with a trimmed beard and the kind of eyes that assessed things on a fixed scale of value. He looked at her the way he probably looked at all things, measuring. "Mrs. Mercer?" he said. "That's right," she said. "Is your husband here?" "He'll be back by midday," she said. "You want to wait, or you want to tell me what this is about?" He studied her for a moment. "My name is Colton," he said. "I represent certain land interests in this area, and I was hoping to have a conversation with Mr. Mercer about his property." She didn't let anything move in her face. "He's had that conversation," she said. "He gave you his answer." Colton smiled. It was a practice smile, the kind that didn't mean anything. "That was some time ago," he said. "Situations change. I was hoping we might revisit the matter." The deed is in order," she said. "The land is his. Those facts haven't changed." Colton looked at her for a longer moment. Something shifted in his expression, just slightly. The smile getting thinner, more considered. "You seem like a practical woman, Mrs. Mercer," he said. "I am," she said, "which is why I'll tell you plainly that any offer you're going to make is less than this land is worth, and any pressure you're going to apply has already been noted with Judge Farnham's office, so we'd be starting from a position where you have less to work with than you might think." A beat of silence. The horse shifted under him. "I see," he said. "The fence on the eastern line has been repositioned twice," she said. "My husband's kitchen garden was deliberately damaged in September. That's all in the record, too." Colton's eyes were on her steadily. "I don't know anything about a garden," he said. "Of course not," she said. "Good day, Mr. Colton." He held her gaze for one more moment, then touched the brim of his hat and turned the horse around and rode back down the trail without another word. She watched him go until the trees took him. When her hands stopped shaking, she went inside and put water on to boil, because she needed something to do with her hands, and tea was as good as anything. Boone came back before noon. She told him about the visit while they ate, precisely and in order, the way she'd learned he preferred information. Fact first, interpretation after. When she finished, he was quiet for a long stretch. "You told him about the record with Farnham," he said. "Yes. That was smart. It might also mean they'll move faster now that they know we're documenting things," she said. "I've been thinking about that. So have I," he said. She looked at him across the table. His face was doing the thing it did when he had been carrying something heavy for a while and had decided it was time to put it down somewhere visible. "I should have fought this more directly 2 years ago," he said, "before it got to this point. I kept thinking if I just held the line, they'd move on to easier ground." "They haven't," she said. "No," he said. "They haven't." He looked at his hands on the table, those enormous hands that could split a log or set a fence post or, she had seen, hold a cracked mug with the kind of care you give to something that matters. "I was alone before," he said. "When you're alone and you've got enemies you can't see clearly, sometimes it's easier to just sit still, hope the storm goes around." She understood that better than she wanted to admit. She had spent years sitting still hoping things would go around. "What do you need?" she asked. He looked up. "From me," she said. "Going forward. What do you actually need?" He was quiet for a moment. Outside, the wind pushed against the cabin and the fire leaned slightly and recovered. "I need someone who won't lose their nerve," he said. "I've had people around me before who went soft when things got hard. I can't afford that. I didn't come up this mountain because things were easy," she said. "No," he said. "I know that." "Then you have what you need," she said. He looked at her for a long moment in the way she had learned to read by now. That steady, taking stock look that was his version of saying something that mattered. Then he nodded, once, and went back to his food. Outside, the snow that had held off all morning began to come down in the slow, deliberate way that meant it intended to stay. The fire held, the cabin held, and whatever was coming up the mountain toward them had not arrived yet, which meant they still had time to be ready. Neither of them said that out loud. They didn't need to. The snow melted off the high slopes in late March, slow and reluctant, the way winter always left the Grey Rock Range. Not all at once, but in retreating patches, holding on in the shadowed places under the tree line long after the open ground had gone to mud. Abigail watched it go from the porch each morning with her coffee, cataloging what the winter had done to the property, what needed fixing first, what could wait. The cabin had held. The animals had all come through. The root cellar had been depleted but not cleaned out, which meant they'd planned correctly. These were not small things, and she had learned to count them. What she had not counted on was how quiet March could be on a mountain when something was building. The Grubb brothers had not come near the property since November. Colton had not come back. The fence on the eastern line had stayed where Boone had last set it. In another life, or with a different kind of disposition, she might have taken that quiet as a good sign. Instead, it sat wrong with her, the way a pain that suddenly stops hurting sits wrong with a person who knows the body. Boone felt it too. She could tell by the way he rode the fence line more often than he needed to, coming back with the same report each time. Nothing moved, nothing broken, and yet going again anyway, because the going itself was doing something that sitting still could not. "They're planning something," he said one evening, without preamble, while she was mending a tear in his work coat. "I know," she said. She didn't look up from the needle. "I don't know what," he said. "Neither do I yet," she said. "But when they move, they'll move bigger than a garden and 3 fence posts. Colton's not a man who escalates slowly. He's a man who waits until he can do enough damage all at once." Boone was quiet. She could hear him thinking. "When it happens," he said, I want you down in the valley, at Farnham's, or anywhere with people." She set the coat down and looked at him. "No." "Abigail, no," she said again, same tone, no rise in it. "I'm not going to be somewhere safe while you deal with whatever they send up here. That's not how this works." "You're my wife," he said. "That means something to me." "It means the same thing to me," she said, "which is why I'm not going to hide." She picked the coat back up. "If you wanted someone who would disappear when things got hard, you should have put different language in that notice." He stared at her for a long moment. She kept her eyes on the mending. "You are the most stubborn person I have ever met," he said. "I've been called worse," she said. A beat, and then something in his voice shifted. Not quite amusement, but the cousin of it. "By who?" "Most of Black Hollow, at one point or another," she said. He let out a short breath that was almost a laugh. Not quite, but close enough. April came in wet and cold, and with it came Grady Cole, who made his mountain runs with a regularity that she had come to depend on for news from the valley. He arrived on a Thursday morning, looking like a man who had been carrying something uncomfortable and was relieved to put it down. He drank the coffee she gave him and looked between them across the table and said, "I'm not sure how to say what I need to say, so I'll just say it." "That's generally best," Abigail said. "There's talk in town," Grady said. "Serious talk. About Boone." He looked at the man across from him. "Someone's been saying you attacked Wade Grubb, that you went to their property in February and roughed him up over the fence dispute." The silence in the room changed character entirely. Boone's face had gone still in the way that wasn't calm but looked like it. "I haven't been near Grubb's property since October," he said. "I know that," Grady said. "But Wade's got a split lip and 2 cracked ribs, and he's telling anyone who'll listen that you rode down there and put them on him. And people—" He stopped, looked at his coffee. "People are listening. Because it's you. Because it was him. Because Boone Mercer was the man who lived alone on the mountain and scared children and had a scar that made him look like violence, even when he was standing still. Because the story required almost no selling when the subject was a man like that." Abigail's hands were flat on the table. "Who else has heard this?" "Farnham," Grady said. "Sunderman, obviously. The Aldrich family. Most of the saloon crowd, which means most of the town by now." He hesitated. "There's talk about a sheriff's inquiry. The county sheriff, not just local. Wade's saying he wants charges pressed." "On what evidence?" she said. "His word," Grady said. "And Silas's. They're claiming Silas saw it too." She looked at Boone. His jaw was set. The scar on his left side had gone white, the way it did when he was holding something very tightly inside. "When they say February," she said carefully. "Do they say a date?" Grady thought. "Second week, Wade says. around the 10th or 11th. Boone was here the second week of February, she said. Both of us were. There was a 3-day blow starting the 8th. Snow so heavy you couldn't ride the trail. He didn't go anywhere. You're his wife, Grady said, not unkindly. They'll say you'd say that. I know, she said. Is there anyone else who would know about the storm? Anyone who came through or couldn't get through during that time? Grady thought again. Jeb Moss was trying to make the run-up with a load of timber, he said slowly. Had to turn back at the lower crossing because the trail was impassable. He was complaining about it for a week afterward. Jeb Moss, she said. He's not a friend of Boone's, Grady said, or an enemy. He's just an independent witness, she said. Good. Boone had been silent through this. He said now, they're going to use the inquiry to freeze the property. If I'm under investigation for assault, any legal proceedings about the land get complicated. Yes, she said. They don't actually need a conviction, he said. They just need enough confusion to create room. Yes, she said again. She was thinking fast, running ahead of the immediate problem to the shape of the thing behind it. They'll also need someone at the county level. A county sheriff's inquiry doesn't happen because Wade Grubb has a sore rib. Someone with reach has to push it. Colton, Boone said. Colton, she agreed. Which means the inquiry and the land grab are the same move. Grady looked between them like a man watching a card game he didn't quite understand. What are you going to do? He said. Abigail looked at Boone. He looked back at her with those gray eyes that she had been reading for 7 months, and in them now she could see two things sitting side by side. The tiredness of a man who had been fighting a version of this for years, and something else, something that had not been there in the fall, a kind of steadiness that was not the same as resignation. I'm going down to town, she said. She went the next morning before Boone was fully awake enough to argue with her about it. She left a note on the table. Gone to Farnham's. Back by dark. Don't do anything I'd have to hear about later. Which was as close to humor as she could manage at 5 in the morning, and rode the bay mare down the mountain trail in the gray early light, with the cold working through her coat and the trees dripping around her from the overnight rain. She had thought hard about what she was doing and why, and had arrived at something she needed to be clear-eyed about. She was not riding into Black Hollow as Boone Mercer's wife going to plead for her husband. She was riding in as a person who had information, who understood the legal dimensions of what was happening, and who was not afraid of the people she was about to talk to. Whether she was actually afraid was a different question. She was. She was afraid in the particular way of someone who has decided to do a thing anyway, which is the only kind of courage that amounts to anything. Farnham's office was at the east end of the main street, above the land registry. She tied the mare and went up the stairs and knocked before she'd let herself hesitate. Raymond Farnham opened the door in his shirt sleeves, holding a ledger, and looked at her with the expression of a man who had half expected this visit and wasn't certain how to feel about it. Mrs. Mercer, he said. Judge Farnham, she said. I need 20 minutes and I'd like to use them now, if that's possible. He looked at her for a moment. Then he stepped back and let her in. She laid it out for him the way she had composed it in her head on the ride down. The timeline, the storm, Jeb Moss as a witness to the impassable trail, the letter she had filed in the fall documenting the fence interference and the garden damage, Colton's February visit and the land interest he represented, the pattern of escalation that had preceded the assault accusation. She spoke for most of the 20 minutes without stopping, not because she was nervous, but because the material required it. Farnham listened. He was a man she had never been able to read entirely. He had the careful blankness of someone who had learned to keep his reactions to himself, which was probably a useful trait in a judge and a difficult one in a neighbor. When she finished, he was quiet for a moment. The storm, he said. You're certain of the dates. I kept a record, she said, and produced the folded pages she had brought, her own notes from the winter, written in the methodical way she kept track of everything, dates and weather and supplies and incidents. She had started doing it in October after the garden was destroyed, because she understood by then that records were the only kind of evidence that survived. Farnham looked at the pages. You kept a daily log. I keep track of things, she said. Wade Grubb's claim is that the 10th or 11th, he said. I have 5 entries from the 8th through the 12th documenting the storm, she said, including a note that the horses couldn't be exercised because the yard was drifted over. He set the pages down and looked at her over them with an expression she couldn't quite name. "Mrs. Mercer," he said, "I want to ask you something directly." "Go ahead," she said. "Your husband is not a man who makes things easy," he said. "He never has been. The people who are making these claims against him, they have money, and they have connections, and they have the ear of the county seat. Whatever I put in a record here, it can be complicated by people with resources." "I understand that," she said. "Do you understand that coming in here and making this case, you're making yourself part of this? That they'll come after your credibility as readily as his?" She looked at him steadily. "Judge Farnham," she said, "they were coming after my credibility the day I put that notice down from your board and said I'd answer it. That happened before I ever went up the mountain. I don't have a version of this life where I'm safe from their opinion of me, so I might as well be useful." Farnham was quiet for a long time. Something moved through his expression that she still couldn't entirely name. "Jeb Moss is in town," he said. "He came in yesterday with a lumber order." "Then maybe now would be a good time to speak with him," she said. Jeb Moss was a compact, weathered man of about 55 who ran a small timber operation out of the lower foothills and had the permanently skeptical look of a man who had been lied to enough times to make skepticism a default position. He was not a fan of Boone Mercer. There had been some old boundary question between them years ago that had been resolved, but not warmly. She knew this and had decided it didn't matter. What mattered was that he had no reason to lie for Boone, which meant his account would carry weight that hers couldn't. She found him at the livery overseeing the loading of his wagon and introduced herself without preamble. "I know who you are," he said, not rudely. "You're the woman who married Mercer." "That's right," she said. "I need to ask you about the storm in February, the blow that hit the 8th. He looked at her sideways. "What about it?" "You were trying to make a run up the trail and had to turn back," she said. "The crossing was impassable. Lost 2 days," he said. "Cost me money. What's your point?" "My point is that trail was impassable for 3 days," she said, "which means no one rode up or down it during that time, including my husband." Moss studied her. He was working something through behind his eyes. "This about the grub thing," he said. "Yes." "Wade's saying Mercer beat him up," he said. "In February," she said, "on a day when the trail was under 4 feet of snow and no horse alive would have made it through." Moss chewed on that. He looked at his wagon, at his horses, at the street. He looked like a man who would rather be somewhere this conversation wasn't happening. "I'm not going to stand up for Boone Mercer as a character," he said finally. "Me and him have got history." "I know," she said. "I'm not asking you to stand up for him as a character. I'm asking you to say what you know about a trail in February, which is a factual matter that has nothing to do with whether you like him." Moss looked at her for a long moment. "You're not what I expected," he said. She had heard that before. "What will it take?" she said. "Nothing," he said, and there was something almost annoyed in his tone, like she'd insulted him by implying he needed something. "I know what I saw. Trail was washed and drifted both. No one was coming or going. I'll say so to Farnham if he asks." "Thank you," she said. "Don't thank me," he said. "I'm not doing it for you or for him. I just don't care for liars." She took that for what it was worth, which was considerable, and left him to his wagon. She was walking back toward the far end of the street when she heard her name. She turned. It was Clara Hooks, who had been the one to spread the story of her marriage through the whole of Black Hollow inside of 48 hours. Clara was a woman of middle age who wore her opinions visibly, and right now her opinion was something complicated, curiosity and discomfort in about equal measure. "Abigail," she said, "what are you doing in town?" "Business," Abigail said. Clara looked at her the way she had always looked at her, that assessing look that took inventory and found the inventory lacking. Then something shifted in it, just slightly. "Is it true what they're saying about Boone?" she said. "That he attacked Wade Grubb?" "No," Abigail said. "It isn't true." "How do you know?" "Because he was home with me during the days in question," she said. "Because the trail was impassable and no one rode it for 3 days. Because I have documentation of all of it." She paused. "And because I know the man I married, Clara." Clara was quiet. She looked at the ground and then back up. I said some unkind things, she said. When the news went around, about you and him. I know, Abigail said. I thought you were... She stopped. I thought you were making a desperate decision. I was making the only decision available to me, Abigail said, which isn't the same as a desperate one. She looked at Clara directly. He's a fair man. He's kept every word he said to me. The people making these claims against him are not doing it because he hurt anyone. They're doing it because they want his land, and this is their method. Clara absorbed that. Around them, the street moved with its ordinary business, the livery, the general store, a dog investigating something near the saloon steps. Black Hollow, in the middle of an ordinary morning. What are you going to do? Clara asked. Same question Grady had asked. She was beginning to understand it was the question everyone was going to ask her. Whatever needs doing, she said, and left Clara on the boardwalk and walked back to where the bay mare was tied. She had what she'd come for. Farnham had her documentation. Jeb Moss would speak to the trail conditions. The record she'd been building since October was now visible to someone who could use it. Whether it would be enough, she genuinely did not know. Colton had money and reach and a county sheriff in some pocket somewhere, probably. The Grubb brothers had a story and the credibility that came from simply not being Boone Mercer. The cards were not evenly distributed. She untied the mare and stood there for a moment in the street, looking up at the Grey Rock Range in the distance, the high peaks still carrying winter's white, the trail invisible from here but somewhere up in those slopes. She thought about the cabin, about the fire they kept going through February, about the fiddle music and the cracked mug repaired with wire, and the man who set her coffee on the left side without ever being asked. She mounted and rode. The sky above the mountains was the hard, clear blue of late April, and the air smelled of pine and cold water and the particular freshness of high country in the spring, and she rode back up toward it with her jaw set and her mind already moving ahead, because the thing she had learned on the mountain in the winter, in the years before all of that, was that you did not get to stop thinking just because you were tired. The trouble was not done. It had barely started. But neither was she. She made it back to the cabin before dark, as she'd promised. Boone was on the porch when she rode in, standing with his arms crossed, and the particular stillness he carried when he had been waiting and was not going to admit how long. She unsaddled the mare, turned her into the corral, and came across the yard and told him everything. Farnham, Moss, Clara hooks on the boardwalk, the documentation she'd presented, the shape of what she thought was coming next. He listened the way he always listened, without interrupting, without letting his face do anything too visible. When she finished, the night had come in fully around them, and the stars over the ridge were sharp and cold. Jeb Moss, he said finally. He agreed. He said he doesn't care for liars, she said, which appears to be true regardless of how he feels about you. Something moved in Boone's expression. Not gratitude, exactly. Something more complicated. The look of a man who has been alone long enough that other people doing decent things still surprises him slightly, even when he won't say so. Farnham will sit on it, he said, even with the documentation. He's not a man who moves fast. No, she agreed. But he's a man who keeps records, and right now the record is the most important thing. If the county sheriff comes down here with a warrant, we need Farnham's file already full before that conversation starts. Boone was quiet. He looked out over the dark valley below, where the lights of Black Hollow made a faint scatter against the black. They're going to do something else, he said. Before this gets to any official proceeding, Colton's not going to wait for a hearing. Did ye see Chucky's that ye about? I know, she said. I've been thinking about what, he said. So have I, she said. Come inside, it's cold. They sat at the table with the fire going and talked it through the way they had learned to talk things through over the winter. She laying out the logical structure, he filling in the practical knowledge of the land and the players, both of them poking at the weak points until the picture had some integrity to it. It was, she thought, not unlike reading a deed together. The same process of finding where the language held and where it could be challenged. What they arrived at was not comforting, but it was clear. Colton needed the property, not just to buy it, but to control this section of the Grey Rock Range, because there was water here that the lower range land couldn't sustain cattle operations without. The assault charge was a mechanism to create legal confusion, delay, and public pressure, to make Boone toxic enough that even a successful defense left him weakened. But legal confusion took time, and Colton was not a patient man underneath the polished coat. If the documentation route was closing off, he would go around it. The cabin, Boone said. She looked at him. If something happened to the cabin, he said, if it burned, or the supplies were gone, or the animals were let loose, starting over from nothing in early spring at this elevation, with a legal case hanging, it might be enough. She sat with that. You think they'd burn it? I think they'd like to, he said. Whether they'd actually, He stopped. I don't know Colton well enough to know where his line is. We should know, she said. She went to bed that night and lay awake constructing scenarios, which was not the most restful way to spend the dark hours, but was honest about where her mind was. Boone slept beside her, or didn't sleep, she couldn't always tell. He was so still either way. At some point, she reached across and put her hand over his, not dramatically, not with any particular ceremony, just placed it there. After a moment, his hand turned over and held hers. They lay like that for a while in the dark, not speaking, and eventually she slept. 3 days later, the outbuilding caught fire. She smelled it before she saw it. The particular sharp wrongness of wood burning that shouldn't be burning. Not the clean smell of the hearth fire, but something panicked and fast. She was in the main room, and she came out of the door before the thought was fully formed, and the outbuilding was already going, the north wall bright and climbing. The horses in the corral throwing themselves against the fence rails in terror. She ran. She got the corral gate open and pushed the horses through it, out and away from the fire, and she was reaching for the water barrel by the fence when Boone came around the far side of the burning structure from the tree line, moving fast. Get back, he said. The tools. Get back, Abigail. She got back. Not far. She retreated to the far edge of the yard and stood there watching the outbuilding go, the fire taking the roof now, the whole thing bright against the dark of the tree line. There was nothing to be done about the building itself. It was already past saving. But the cabin was 30 feet away and the sparks were traveling on the night wind, and she spent the next hour on the cabin roof with a wet blanket while Boone worked the ground below with water and dirt. And by some mean luck or good wind direction, the cabin held. The outbuilding did not. By morning, it was a black skeleton of posts still smoking. She stood at the edge of it in the gray light and looked at what was left. The tools that had been stored there were mostly gone. 2 months of hay stores, leather tack and harness, things that could be replaced and would cost time and money they did not currently have in abundance. Boone stood beside her. His face was a mask. It was set, he said. It was not a question. Yes, she said. She had walked the near tree line before dawn and found boot prints in the mud at the forest edge, 2 sets, and the smell of lamp oil near the north wall base where the fire had started. Did you see anyone? No, he said. I was checking the eastern fence when I saw the light. By the time I came back, whoever it was had gone. She looked at the ruined structure. The anger she felt was not the hot, directionless kind. It had somewhere to go, a shape and an address, and that made it useful rather than destructive. This is Colton's line, she said. Now we know where it is. Boone looked at her. He'll burn property, she said. That's useful to know. It means he's not as clean as he looks, and it means there are people who know what he's capable of. Some of those people might be willing to say so if they thought the situation was moving toward accountability. Who? Boone said. No one in this territory is going to stand up against an Ashmont company interest. They've got too much reach. The Grubb brothers do, she said. Think about it. Colton used them as his instrument for the assault charge. He sent riders to burn our outbuilding, but he's also the same man who will eventually want their land too, or excess rights across it. They're not his partners, they're his tools, and tools get dropped when they stop being useful. Boone was very still beside her. They may not know that yet, she said, but they might be willing to hear it. She did not go to the Grubb brothers. Boone did. And she spent the time he was gone doing the kind of productive worrying that involved reorganizing what had been rescued from the outbuilding, calculating what needed to be replaced first, and making a list of every person in Black Hollow who had ever had a negative encounter with Ashmont Company representatives or their operations. The list was longer than she expected. Harlan Greer had lost a supply contract 2 years back, when Ashmont brought in their own provisions operation for the range crews, cutting him out of business he'd counted on for a decade. The Aldrich family's livery had been undercut by Ashmont's own horse operation. Tom Aldrich, who had stood outside his livery and told her she'd regret marrying Boone. His livery that was half empty now because Ashmont's cowhands stabled their horses elsewhere. She sat with the list and thought about how anger and self-interest were different fuels, but both of them burned. Boone came back late in the afternoon. She heard the horse and came to the door and read his face before he dismounted. "Well?" she said. He tied the horse and came across the yard slowly. He had the look of a man who had gone somewhere expecting one thing and found another. "Wade Grubb," he said, "has a broken arm." She stared. "Colton's men?" Apparently there was a disagreement about the terms of the arrangement, Boone said. Wade wanted a larger share of the water rights if the land transfer went through. Colton's representative told him what he thought of that. He paused. "Silas told me. Wade was there, but not much for talking." She absorbed that. "What did Silas say?" "He said enough," Boone said. "He's angry. He's scared. And he's not stupid enough to think that the arm is the worst thing that could happen if he stays in this." "Will he talk?" she said. "Maybe," Boone said. "He needs a reason to think it's worth the risk. Right now he thinks Colton's too protected." "Colton's protected from unofficial pressure," she said. "He's not protected from a formal inquiry if multiple parties are making complaints. Farnham can only sit on so much." She looked at the ruined outline of the outbuilding. "We need to get back to town. Not just you and me this time." What happened over the next 2 weeks was not elegant or swift. It was the slow, unglamorous work of moving people who were afraid toward a position they could defend, one conversation at a time. Abigail went to Harlan Greer first. She sat across his counter and laid out what she knew about the Ashmont Company operation, the pattern across the territory, the way they worked through local proxies, the way they discarded those proxies when they were done, and she watched his face do the thing faces do when a pattern becomes visible that should have been visible before. He wasn't outraged. He was worse than outraged. He was a man doing arithmetic and not liking the answer. "The supply contract," she said. "Was that Colton's doing directly or through someone else?" "Man named Fester," Harlan said. "Came in, talked me out of a competitive renewal, went with an outside operation, said it was efficiency." He was looking at the counter. "Fester works for Ashmont, doesn't he?" "I believe so," she said. Harlan was quiet for a long time. "What do you need?" he said. "I need you to write down what happened with the contract," she said. "Dates, names, terms, the same way I'd need any business record. And I need you to let me show it to Farnham." He looked at her. "I'm not going to court," he said. "You may not have to," she said. "Sometimes a file that's thick enough does the work without anyone standing up in front of anyone." She had that conversation, and then similar ones with Tom Aldrich, with a cattle rancher named Pryor, who had refused an Ashmont offer 2 years ago and found his fence line subsequently harassed, with the widow Marsh who ran the boarding house and had been pressured to sell by a representative she now, in retrospect, believed had been working for the same interests. Not all of them would commit to anything. Pryor flat refused. He had a family and said so, which she respected even if she didn't agree with it. But enough of them would write something down, or allow Farnham to note their account, or simply tell her what they knew on the understanding that she would carry it to someone who could use it. Silas Grubb came into town on a Thursday, without his brother, and went directly to Farnham's office. Abigail found out about it 2 hours later from Grady Cole, who had been at the land registry and seen him go in. She didn't know what Silas said in that room. She never knew the whole of it. But Farnham's expression when she passed him on the street that afternoon was the expression of a man holding more paper than he'd expected, and for the first time it struck her as the expression of a man who was going to do something with it. The formal proceeding, it was not quite a trial. More an inquiry conducted under territorial law before Farnham and 2 county representatives who rode in from the east, happened on a Tuesday in early May when the valley was green and the sky was the hard, clean blue of high spring. Abigail sat in the front row of the small room Farnham used for such things, which smelled of old paper and the particular stuffiness of enclosed official places. Boone sat beside her, which she had insisted on, because she was not going to let him sit in the back of the room where his size and his scar could work against the impression she needed him to make. "Sit here," she'd said that morning, indicating the front. "Don't speak unless they ask you a direct question. Don't react to anything Wade says, whatever it is. And for the love of everything, don't look like you're thinking about hitting anyone." He had looked at her with something that was fully a look of offense. "I don't look like I'm thinking about hitting people." "You look like you're thinking about hitting people," she said. "I love that about you, but today is not the day." Something happened in his face, not quite a smile. Both corners this time, briefly. "Fine," he said. The inquiry lasted 4 hours. Farnham read from his records. The letter she had filed in the fall, the documented fence interference, the account of Colton's February visit. Jeb Moss said what he'd seen about the trail conditions, flatly and without elaboration, in the tone of a man reporting a weather event. Silas Grubb, looking like he hadn't slept since the previous Thursday, gave an account that was partial and visibly uncomfortable, but contained the important fact that Wade's injury had not come from Boone Mercer, and that the assault claim had been made at the suggestion of a third party in exchange for a promised consideration that had not materialized. Wade Grubb said nothing, on account of having developed a sudden and convenient illness that kept him from attending, which the county representatives noted and which clearly did not help the credibility of the original claim. The Ashmont Company had a representative present, not Colton himself, a younger man, a lawyer by his look, who objected to several of Farnham's readings on procedural grounds. The county representatives listened to the objections and noted them and did not sustain them. When it was done, the formal finding was narrow and careful. The assault charge against Boone Mercer was found to be unsupported by the evidence and was dismissed. The property boundary dispute was referred for formal survey at county expense, which was a finding that effectively froze any action the Ashmont Company might have been planning against the land. It was not the thunderclap she had imagined on the worst nights, when she'd lain awake constructing scenarios. It was smaller than that, quieter. Farnham said the words in his usual careful voice and signed the page and handed a copy to Boone, and that was that. Outside on the boardwalk, Boone stood with the copy in his hand and looked at it for a moment without speaking. "It's not over," she said. "A survey can be contested. The company can find other angles." "I know," he said. "But it's different now, dear," she said. "The record is too full for them to come at this quietly. Whatever they do next, they'll have to do it in front of people." He looked at her. The sun was on the street and the spring air was moving through Black Hollow, and around them the ordinary business of the town continued indifferently, the way ordinary life does around extraordinary things. "You built that file," he said. "From the first letter, in October. I kept track of things," she said. "You kept track of things because you could see where it was going before I admitted it," he said. She looked at him directly. "You admitted it. You just admitted it to yourself, not out loud." He was quiet. Then, "I'm not good at asking for help." "I've noticed," she said. He stopped, started again. "I'm grateful. For all of it. For what you did today and in February and the night of the fire and every time you—" He stopped again. She waited. She had learned that he worked toward things at his own pace and that interrupting the process did not speed it up. "I didn't know what to expect when I put that notice up," he said. "I knew what I needed practically. I didn't—" He looked at her with the full honesty that came over him sometimes, the unguarded version that she valued more than she'd ever told him. "I didn't know I was going to get you specifically." She looked at him for a moment. The street moved around them, indifferent and ordinary. "The notice said good sense over good looks," she said. "I figured I qualified on at least one count." He let out a short breath, and this time it was unmistakably a laugh, brief and real and slightly surprised at itself, the way his laughs always were. "Come on," she said. "We've got a long ride home." They walked to where the horses were tied, and she didn't look at the faces on the street around her, at the people who had laughed at the notice she'd taken down, and the decision she'd made, and the man she'd said yes to. She didn't need to look. She knew what she'd done, and why, and what it had cost, and what it had made. She mounted the bay mare and turned her toward the mountain road, and Boone came up beside her, and they rode out of Black Hollow in the clear May afternoon with the Gray Rock Range ahead of them, high and solid and theirs. The county survey team arrived in June, 3 men with instruments and notebooks who spent 4 days on the Grey Rock Range measuring everything that could be measured and writing it down in the precise, dispassionate language of official record. Boone rode with them on the first day to show them the terrain, and Abigail stayed at the cabin and watched the sky and tried not to calculate too hard. The result came back 3 weeks later in a folded document delivered by Farnham's clerk, young Douglas, who had ridden up the mountain trail with the careful expression of someone doing an important errand and knowing it. She read it at the table while Boone stood at the window. The eastern boundary was confirmed exactly as the deed described. The spring was on Mercer land. The posts the Grubb brothers had moved and moved again were noted, their original positions established in the official record in language that left no room for future interpretation. She set the document down. "That's it," she said. Boone turned from the window. "Done?" "As done as a survey can make it," she said. "They'd have to challenge the methodology now, which means hiring their own surveyors and filing a counterclaim. And after what came out in the inquiry, Colton's representative is not going to want to put the Ashmont Company name on more paper in this territory." Boone came and looked at the document over her shoulder. He read slowly, the way he always read, making sure of each thing before moving past it. Then he set his hand on the table beside the paper, and she put hers over it, and they stayed like that for a moment in the quiet of the cabin. It was not a triumphant moment, exactly. It was more the feeling of something that had been clenched for a very long time, finally, carefully, releasing. Not all at once, but enough to breathe. "I want to rebuild the outbuilding," he said, "before the fall." "I know," she said. "I've been thinking about the design. If we move the placement 8 feet south, we can use the slope to put in a proper floor rather than just packed earth. Drain better in the spring thaw." He looked at her sideways. "You've been drawing this out in your head." "Since February," she said. He made the sound that was his laugh when he was trying not to show it. "Of course you have." Ben. They broke ground on the new outbuilding in July, and the work of it was its own kind of resolution. Physical and uncomplicated. The satisfaction of posts set plumb and timber-fitted square, of a thing taking shape under your hands that would be there and useful long after the trouble that necessitated it was forgotten. Boone was a good builder. She had not known this about him in the abstract. She had known he'd built the cabin. But building something once and being genuinely skilled were different things. He worked with the focused economy of a man who understood materials and didn't waste them, and he could look at a problem in 3 dimensions and see the solution before she had finished describing it. She learned from watching him the way she had learned most useful things, quietly, without announcing it, filing the knowledge away. She was useful in her own ways. She had a good eye for level and could read a square as well as he could. She could lift more than most people expected, which was a fact she had always found privately amusing in the way of things the world underestimates. And she could calculate load and stress with a basic arithmetic that surprised him the first time she used it, standing in front of the partially framed roof and explaining why the ridge beam needed to be seated differently. He had looked at her, then at the beam, then back. "Where did you learn that?" "My father's house had a sagging roof," she said. "I spent 3 months figuring out why before I gave up and just shored it from below. By the end, I understood the theory, even if I couldn't fix the thing." "You tried to fix your father's roof," he said. "I tried to fix most things about my father's situation," she said, "with variable success." He was quiet for a moment in the way he went quiet when something had touched the edge of something that mattered. "You've been fixing things for a long time," he said. "Since I was about 12, she said. "Yes." She said it without self-pity, because she didn't feel self-pity about it. It was just the truth of where she had come from. The same way his 14 years of solitude on the mountain were the truth of where he had come from. You didn't get to choose the education life gave you. You only chose whether to use it. He picked up the ridge beam without further comment and reseated it the way she'd suggested, and it sat right, and they moved on. The Ashmont Company sent no more representatives. No one came up the mountain with offers or threats, or the polite violence of men who wanted what wasn't theirs. Whether Colton had moved his attention elsewhere, or whether the inquiry and the survey and the full file in Farnham's office had simply made the cost of continuing too high, she never knew for certain. What she knew was the absence of it. The way the fall came in and the mountain settled into its winter preparations and nothing happened except the ordinary hard work of preparing for cold. It took her a while to stop waiting for the other boot to drop. She would catch herself sometimes, listening for hoofbeats on the trail or scanning the tree line in the evening for movement. The habit of vigilance didn't dissolve the moment the threat did. She supposed it wouldn't, not entirely, not after the year they'd had. But it quieted over time, the way a noise that's been constant eventually fades into the background. And then, one day, you notice it's gone. Boone had his own version of this. He slept lighter than he used to, or maybe she just noticed it more now that she knew him well enough to read the quality of his stillness. There were nights when she woke and found him standing at the window, looking out at nothing in particular, and she would watch him for a moment from the bed, and then he would come back and lie down, and she would not say anything, because some things don't need to be said. Once in October, she asked him, "Do you think it's finished? Really finished?" He thought about it, which she appreciated. He did not give her easy answers. "I think Colton's moved on to ground with less trouble attached," he said. "I think if the Ashmont Company wants to come back, they'll need a different approach. And we'll see it earlier now. The survey's public record. The inquiry's public record. We're harder to move quietly." He paused. "I don't think anything is finished exactly, but I think it's different." "Different how?" "Before, I was a man alone on a mountain with a deed and no one who'd back the deed in a room," he said. "Now I'm not." She lay there thinking about that, about what it meant for a man who had been alone for 14 years to say, "I'm not without any self-consciousness about it." "No," she said, "you're not." The second winter was not easier than the first, because the mountain did not make concessions to experience, but it was different in the way that Boone had meant. There was a kind of fluency to it now between the two of them, an understanding of each other's rhythms and capabilities that made the work go differently. Not faster, necessarily. Just less friction. She had gotten strong, not in any dramatic way. She had always been a strong woman, built for it whether she'd wanted to be or not. But the mountain work had put a different kind of strength into her, the kind that knew its own endurance, that understood how to pace across a long day without burning out in the first hour. She could split wood now with a technique that Boone had shown her, and she had spent 3 weeks perfecting. And the satisfaction of a round of wood going clean under a well-placed axe was a simple pleasure that she had not expected to mean as much as it did. Small things mattered up here. She had learned that. The difference between a meal that was just filling and one that was actually good. The particular warmth of a fire built with dry wood versus green. The way a task done correctly the first time saved you 4 tasks down the road. The accumulation of small things done right was what the mountain ran on, and she had come to understand it the way you understand a language. First consciously, and then, without noticing the transition, fluently. In January, she found out she was pregnant. She sat with it for a day before she told Boone, not because she was uncertain about telling him, but because she wanted to know her own mind before she put the information into the space between them. She was not frightened, which surprised her a little. She searched for the right word, sobered. The way you are when something you abstractly understood becomes suddenly, concretely real. She told him in the evening, at the table, after supper. Plainly, the way she told him most things. He went very still. She watched him and waited. "Are you all right?" he said finally. "I think so," she said. I feel all right. I'll know more in a few weeks." He looked at the table, then at her. His face was doing something she hadn't seen before. Something unguarded in a way that went beyond the glimpses she'd had before. Something that was, she thought, the expression of a man who had stopped expecting certain things and was now confronted with one of them. He stopped. "I had stopped thinking this was something that would happen for me," he said. "I know," she said. "Me too." He reached across his table and took her hand in both of his, the way he had reached for hers that night in the dark when she'd laid it over his. His hands were rough and very warm. "We'll need to get the doctor up from the valley in the spring," she said, because she was who she was and the practical things needed saying. "And the second room, I'll expand it," he said, "before the thaw. The floor is drafty on the east side." "I'll fix it," he said. "I'm just—" "Abigail," he said. She stopped. "Stop planning for a minute," he said. She looked at him. He was looking at her with the full, unguarded version of himself, no distance in it, nothing held back for the sake of dignity or habit. "All right," she said. They sat there for a while without talking, his hands around hers, the fire doing its work, the mountain holding the cabin in the cold January night, and she let herself stay in that moment without running ahead of it, for once. Spring came late, the way springs did at elevation, grudging and incremental. But it came. It always came. The garden went in on a May morning when the soil had finally dried enough to work, and Abigail knelt in the turned earth in the thin spring sunshine and pressed seeds in with her thumb the way she had done the first time, the way she'd done it every year of her life she could remember. The difference was that her back ached differently now, and she had to pause more than she used to. And Boone came out twice to check on her in the way he'd taken to checking on her, not hovering but appearing at intervals with water or an unnecessary question about something else. She let him. It cost her nothing, and it was his way of doing something for her when there was not much to be done. And she had learned the value of letting people care in the language they had. The beans went in first, then the squash, then the root vegetables in their rows, each one placed with the same deliberate attention as the last, because the work didn't change just because the circumstances around it did. She thought, kneeling in the dirt with her hands in the soil, about the woman who had stood in Harlan Greer's general store on a morning with $7.32 in her pocket and taken a notice off a board. She had not been brave, exactly. She had been out of options and clear-eyed enough to see which of the remaining ones was real. That was not the same as bravery, though it might look like it from the outside. She thought about what people had said, that she was desperate, that she'd regret it, that the man she'd chosen was dangerous, broken, too far outside the edges of what was acceptable for anyone to willingly choose. And she thought about what she knew now that she hadn't known then, that the people saying those things were measuring with a ruler they'd been handed without questioning, and that the ruler was wrong, and that the things it failed to measure were the things that actually held a life together. Boone was not a gentleman in the conventional sense. He was not soft-spoken, or easy to read, or quick to express what was in him. He had a temper, though he contained it. He had the particular stubbornness of a person who had been hurt enough times that trust had become something requiring significant investment before he gave it. He was not a man who would ever be easy to live with, and she was not a woman who was easy to live with either. And the combination of them was frequently friction and occasionally absurdity, and sometimes, in the best moments, the particular satisfaction of two people who understand each other well enough to disagree without damage. She had not saved him. That was not what had happened, and she was clear-eyed enough to know the difference between the story people might want to tell about them and the one that was true. He had not saved her either. They had arrived at the same mountain by different routes, both carrying damage and stubbornness and a practical competence born of necessity, and they had built something out of those materials that neither of them could have built alone. That was not rescue. That was just construction. The kind that takes a long time and doesn't always go according to plan, and still somehow, against ordinary odds, holds. Grady Cole came through on his regular run in June, a month before the baby was expected, and he brought news and a letter. The news was that Colton had relocated his operations entirely, the Ashmont Company having apparently met resistance in this territory sufficient to make other territories more attractive. The Grubb brothers had sold their operation, not to Ashmont, to a family from the Eastern Valley named Pruitt, who, by all accounts, were ordinary people who wanted to run cattle and had no particular interest in anyone's spring water. Silas had gone south. Wade had gone somewhere else, or so Grady had heard, though he was less certain of that. The letter was from Clara Hooks, which surprised her enough that she stood holding it for a moment before opening it. It was not a long letter, and it was not eloquent. Clara was a woman of strong opinions who had not been given to introspection, and the letter reflected that, a little awkward in its phrasing, aware of itself in the way of someone doing something they weren't practiced at. But what it said was plain enough, that the town had heard what happened at the inquiry, that people understood more now about what the Ashmont Company had been doing in the territory, that there was some feeling in Black Hollow that things had been said and assumed that perhaps should not have been, that Abigail and her husband were considered neighbors now by those with any sense. She read it twice. Then she set it down on the table and looked out the window at the mountain. It was not an apology, precisely. It was the thing people offer when they can't quite bring themselves to say the word but need to cover the distance anyway. She understood it for what it was. She did not feel vindicated. She had thought once that this moment, if it came, would feel like vindication, would feel like the satisfaction of having been right when people said she was wrong. But the moment she was sitting in was too full of too many other things for vindication to find much room. The garden was coming up. The new outbuilding stood solid and properly drained on its better-placed foundation. The cabin had been expanded and the east floor repaired. The baby moved sometimes in the evenings, and she would put her hand against the movement and think thoughts she didn't have words for yet. You don't build a life by proving something to the people who doubted you. That was what she had learned, or maybe what she had always known, and had taken a mountain and a hard year and a man with gray eyes and a scarred face to confirm. You build it by doing the thing in front of you, and then the thing after that, by keeping track of what matters and letting go of what doesn't, by choosing over and over again in all the ordinary moments, to be useful rather than defeated. Boone came in from the pasture as she was making supper, and she handed him the letter without comment. He read it standing at the door, then folded it and set it on the shelf. "Huh," he said. "Is that all?" She said, "What do you want me to say?" "I don't want you to say anything in particular," she said. "I'm just noting that the word huh covers a lot of territory." He looked at her with the expression she had come to love most, the one that was trying not to be a smile and failing. "It's good," he said. "It's a good thing. I don't trust it yet, but it's good." "That seems about right," she said. He came to the table and sat down, and she set the food out and sat across from him. And outside the cabin, the June evening was long, and the light was going gold over the valley below, and the mountains were the way they always were, vast and indifferent and beautiful in their indifference, making no promises and requiring everything. She had come up this mountain with $7 and a borrowed mare and the willingness to be thought a fool by everyone who knew her, and she had found, not what she'd hoped for, because she hadn't hoped carefully enough to predict this, but something better than hope, something with actual weight to it. A life that was hard in all the ways that meant the hardness came from real things, not from the world's opinion of who she was allowed to be. That was not nothing. That was not nothing at all. Boone reached across the table for the bread, and his hand brushed hers, and neither of them moved away. And the fire was good, and outside the mountain held them in its enormous indifferent dark, and they ate their supper together in the cabin they had kept, on the land they had held, in the life they had made from what they'd been given, and the considerable amount of what they had refused to give up.